no need to rehash. Who's on the roster? We know what the quote unquote, I guess we could say battle. It's going to be Graham Mertz. It's going to be Jack Miller. Max Brown is the third guy. He's going to be doing some baseball this spring as well. But guys, I guess maybe a question I'll pose: how quick, if at all, does Mertz assert himself as the starter? Is it right away? Is he taking the 1 reps right away? Will we even get to see that? Will Billy Napier even tell us that when the Gators hit the spring practice field on Saturday? Look, I think we kind of all lean the way of Mertz being the guy, maybe taking most of the 1 reps throughout the spring, ends up being the guy coming out of spring as the number 1 quarterback. But what if this is a true battle? Like, admittedly, no, I'm not hiding anything here. If you've listened to Gators Breakdown, I'm not big on the potential of Jack Miller, but he was injured last year, played with a depleted roster in the bowl game, coming off of injury as well. So we can admit, not the best circumstances to maybe figure out ultimately what Jack Miller is at Florida. Does he have it in him to make this a battle? And if so, we have no idea the real reasoning for it. There will certainly be some narratives out there that Mertz can't, one narrative will be out there. He can't separate himself from Miller. So the quarterback position will be lacking. The less popular narrative will be Miller maybe beating out Mertz. That means he's ready to lead Florida to a season that rises above expectations. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out and how Napier reacts to the battle. I think looking at it from a coaching perspective, how long does it take for him to hand the spot over if Mertz is going to be outperforming Miller either right away, or does it take a couple of practices? Does it take a couple of weeks? I guess, the biggest question in taking all this into account is how long, if it is a battle, does the battle take place in spring practice?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing here is really Brown, in my estimation. If Brown comes in and can push, then I suspect that Mertz or Miller are going to get less reps and they're going to give him an opportunity. But look, you got to know what you have, right? And you've had an entire year to evaluate Miller. And so I think you give Mertz as many snaps as is necessary to prove whether he is or isn't the guy. And remember, Napier already talked about going out in the transfer portal to pick up somebody else potentially after spring practice. And so that's what you're trying to figure out. You're trying to figure out, do I need to, is it a dire situation? Do I absolutely have to have somebody in through the transfer portal? Or am I comfortable with Mertz sort of being a game manager, Miller being his backup, and then Brown kind of being a high upside guy who maybe gets an opportunity in some of the mop-up duty? But, Brown's the guy I'd really look at from a profile perspective. He's the guy who has the potential to be good. Now, whether he can convert into that, I don't know, and certainly the baseball sort of complicates that. But unless Brown pushes early, I think Mertz gets a ton of the snaps just because you have to know what you got.
I made myself a promise, Dave, that I was not going to talk myself into Graham Mertz. I was not going to talk it up. I was not.
Why not?
I wasn't going to try to convince myself by the start of the season that, you know what? It's just one little thing. And you know what? We have looked into Graham Mertz, and there are some differences with how he played in high school in more of a wide open attack versus how he played in college in that very run heavy Wisconsin attack. So there are going to be some differences between Graham Mertz at Wisconsin and Graham Mertz at Florida. But for the most part, we know who this guy is. I believe we know who this guy is for the most part. The biggest thing I can say for Graham Mertz is we had that talent like Anthony Richardson last year. But what did you get? You got this every single week, up and down a little bit. So instead of maybe that ceiling of like a 9 out of 10, your ceiling might be like a 7 out of 10. But maybe there's more 6 and 7s along the way where you're having those steady performances week in, week out. And it might average out to about the same. So that's my hope for Graham Mertz in this system. I don't think they bring Graham Mertz in if they're super excited about Jack Miller. However, I also believe if I were advocating for Jack Miller, I would say it's completely unfair to judge him by throwing him into that Las Vegas Bowl disaster of a game, which I've learned my lesson from the Cotton Bowl a couple of years ago. Not going to discount bowl games anymore and just write it off like it was nothing, even though theoretically you could. But you do have to look at that. But at the same time, his recruiting profile, he went to Ohio State. Ohio State's been pumping out quarterbacks left and right under Ryan Day. Ryan Day saw something in this guy. So I do believe that Jack Miller should deserve a fair shot here in the spring. I think with Max Brown with the baseball stuff, I think that's going to be tough to make any type of impact this spring. But it's a little bit in Mertz we trust this season. I don't think it's going to be Miller, but I also think he should get a fair shot in the spring.
I mean, ideally, you're looking at, if it is a true battle, you hope you have two good quarterbacks. Now, how likely is that between these two guys? I think, myself, I would say I'm overshooting that because, like I said, I haven't been high on Jack Miller ever since he transferred from Ohio State. I wasn't impressed in his Ohio State spring game. I wasn't impressed last year in the Florida spring game. I thought it was a foregone conclusion. If we go back to a year ago, Anthony Richardson's, going to win the job. He's going to be the guy coming out of spring practice. I feel that same way about Graham Mertz. Now, not as far as the potential that I thought Anthony Richardson would reach, but I think when the Florida Gators spring game is over with on April 13th and it's 9:30 at night, I'm going to sit here and say, okay, well, I think it's clear Graham Mertz is the guy. I just wonder, it's kind of going to Will's point, how long does this battle take place? Is it one where Mertz is struggling to maybe separate? Or if there is a battle, it's because Miller has elevated his play and you end up, getting a good battle that, ends up helping Graham Mertz in the end.
I mean, I think if Mertz and Miller end up in a battle, that's probably a bad sign for Florida.
I would think that would probably be the narrative I was going towards earlier, Will. Yeah.
I just look, I think you brought in Mertz because you weren't happy with what you had in Miller and because you needed extra depth, right? And Mertz was somebody they targeted pretty early and brought in early in the process. And, he was there visiting and all of a sudden he was committed and that all happened really quickly. Napier's had a lot of good stuff to say about him. And obviously there is the snail of the Wisconsin offense that's sort of sitting there in the background that makes us wonder whether if you put him behind, not even a Lamborghini, if you just put him in sort of like a Toyota Corolla, is he going to be able to have a halfway decent offense? And obviously the tight ends at Florida are supposed to be a big part of the offense. Do guys like Dante Zanders and Keon Zipper, are they able to take a step up because now you have a quarterback who can hit sort of the short game stuff, the intermediate throws over the middle, the things that just got airmailed a lot last year. So I think this is a transition year. When you look at the overall roster, it's heavily slanted towards guys who have 3 and 4 years of eligibility left. And so if you're going to sort of just bring in a guy to make things competent for a year or two, then Mertz fits that profile. If you're looking to have someone grow with all those young guys, then Brown fits that profile. I think Miller's sort of in between, which really means that, you give him an opportunity because you have to play the best guy out there, right? If Miller comes out and just lights it up in camp, you can't go, well, we brought in Mertz. We promised him he was going to play, so we're going to sit the guy who's the best. Like, that's not going to work on a team where you're making everybody earn the playing time that they get.
And not coming off a 6 and 7 season either.
Well, yeah, but at the same time, let's not pretend that you don't have the last year worth of reps that you've seen from Miller in your head as this is going, right? And so the bowl game isn't necessarily the thing that I look at. What I actually look at is the spring game. So if you go back to the spring game last year, it was clear that Anthony Richardson was a better player when you looked at those two. Now, Richardson was not consistent, right? But the problem is in that spring game, Miller wasn't consistent either. You saw some of those things carry over to the Oregon State game, which is the reason why I think people sort of sit there and say, well, maybe not. We'd like to see what Graham Mertz has. And then to your point, David, you're getting to a point where you're trying to sell hope. You're trying to sell your program. You're trying to sell your offense. If Miller wins the job, he better win it outright because we've seen what he can do. And if you go 6 and 7 again with him behind center, well, then what does that say about your evaluation, bringing in guys through the transfer portal, all that sort of stuff. So there is a narrative, I think, that sort of pushes towards Mertz getting the lion's share of the snaps. And again, I think we'll see a lot of it in the spring game because last year it was pretty clear, right? I mean, they had Richardson on one side, they had Miller on the other. They went back and forth for like 2.5 or 3 quarters before they even brought in the backups. We saw nothing of Jalen Kitna, and then we wound up seeing more of him in 2022 than we saw of Jack Miller. But yeah, I think it's Mertz or bust unless you bring in somebody in the spring is sort of how the staff is probably seeing it. Again, unless Max Brown's able to take a major step forward. And like I said, his high school profile at least suggests that might be a possibility.
Yeah, I don't want to discount the 3 years of starting experience here either for Mertz. I think you go look at that. That's a guy who stepped in right away as a true freshman at Wisconsin and got that starting nod in the COVID year too. I mean, think about how especially difficult that would have been for an incoming freshman during that season, right? So this is a guy that can clearly handle the mental load on him. Wisconsin was going through some other things off the field too. Their recruiting was kind of a mess for a couple of years there with Chris. It wasn't just Mertz not playing up to his ability. That was just part of the equation of what was going on at Wisconsin. There's a reason why Paul Chryst, who was otherwise a fairly good coach at Wisconsin, is out of a job, and they're moving in a completely different direction this year.
All right, there we go. Quarterback talk, getting us ready for spring practice this week.
Want more Gators Breakdown? Join Gators Breakdown Plus. Starting at $3 a month. Get access to unique episodes, plus a blog, chat room, giveaways, shout-outs, and more. Gators Breakdown Plus is furthering the interaction with fans and listeners like you. Head to gatorsbreakdown.supportingcast.fm to join Gators Breakdown Plus today.